Hi, I'm Sarah. The day I walked down the aisle, my father stood up in front of 200 guests and declared, "I want everyone to know I only have 2 children." His voice carried across the Oakwood Country Club like a funeral announcement. My wedding dress suddenly felt like a costume. My bouquet like evidence of some crime I didn't know I'd committed. The gasps from our guests created a silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the crystal chandeliers. But what happened next changed everything. As my father's words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, a man in a dark suit approached the wedding planner. His voice was quiet but unmistakable when he asked, "Excuse me, where would you like Madam President to sit for the reception?" The color drained from my father's face, faster than water through broken glass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd always believed that love could bridge any gap, heal any wound, silence any doubt. Standing in the bridal suite at Oakwood Country Club that September morning, adjusting my grandmother's pearl necklace one final time, I thought the hardest part was behind us. The months of planning, the careful budget discussions, the delicate navigation of guest lists and seating charts. David and I had worked through every detail together, his calm presence steadying my nerves whenever wedding stress threatened to overwhelm me. He had this way of placing his hand on my shoulder and saying, "Sarah, at the end of the day, we'll be married. Everything else is just decoration." His certainty had become my anchor. My best friend Ashley stood behind me, fastening the tiny buttons that ran up my spine like a ladder to heaven. Through the window, I could see guests beginning to arrive, parking their cars along the circular drive that wound through the manicured grounds of Riverside's most prestigious venue. The Oakwood Country Club had been my father's choice, his way of announcing to the town that the Mitchell family had arrived somewhere important. The cost had stretched our budget thin, but Bob Mitchell wasn't about to let his daughter get married at the VFW hall like the Kowalski girl had last spring. My mother Linda bustled into the room carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the navy blue dress we'd chosen together at Macy's 3 months earlier. Her smile was bright but brittle around the edges, the way it got when she was working overtime to keep peace between my father and me. "You look absolutely radiant, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone mothers use when they're trying to convince themselves everything will work out fine. She set the coffee on the vanity and adjusted an invisible wrinkle in my veil. "Your father's just putting on his boutonniere. He'll be up in a minute to walk you down." The mention of my father sent a familiar knot of anxiety through my stomach. Bob Mitchell loved me, I knew that much, but he'd never quite forgiven me for choosing David. In his mind, I was settling for a man who didn't measure up to the Mitchell family standards he'd spent 30 years building in this town. David worked remotely for some consulting firm, which my father translated as unemployed but too proud to admit it. He lived in a modest apartment, drove a 5-year-old Honda, and had never shown interest in joining the Rotary Club or the church board. These weren't character flaws in my eyes, but to my father they were red flags spelling out a future of financial instability and social embarrassment. The tension had been building for months. Sunday dinners became exercises in polite interrogation, with my father asking David increasingly pointed questions about his career prospects and 5-year plans. David answered everything with patience and honesty, but I could see my father's skepticism growing with each vague response about government contracts and, quote, classified projects. When David explained that he couldn't discuss the specifics of his work due to confidentiality agreements, my father's expression suggested he thought David was either lying or involved in something suspicious. The breaking point had come 3 weeks earlier during what was supposed to be a casual barbecue in our backyard on Maple Street. My father had been drinking beer since noon, and by evening, his filter had completely dissolved. "I just don't understand what you see in him, Sarah," he'd said, loud enough for David to hear from across the patio. "The man won't even tell us what he does for a living. How are you supposed to build a future with someone who keeps secrets?" David had handled it with his usual grace, simply excusing himself to help my mother with the dishes, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. That night, after David had driven back to Columbus, my father and I had our worst fight in years. "You're making a mistake," he'd said, pointing his finger at me the way he used to when I was 16 and missed curfew. "This family has a reputation in this town. Your grandfather built Mitchell's Hardware from nothing. and I've spent my whole life maintaining what he's started. I won't watch you throw it all away for some drifter who showed up 2 years ago with a laptop and a smile. I'd tried to explain that David's reserve came from humility, not deception, that his quiet confidence spoke to a strength my father couldn't recognize. But Bob Mitchell had already made up his mind. In his worldview, a man who didn't brag about his accomplishments probably didn't have any worth mentioning. Now, as Ashley finished with my buttons and Linda fussed with my train, I found myself hoping against hope that my father would find a way to set aside his doubts for just one day. This was supposed to be about love triumphing over obstacles, about two families coming together to celebrate a new beginning. David's mother, Helen, had flown in from California, bringing with her a warmth and acceptance that made me feel genuinely welcomed into their family. His quiet dignity had won over my siblings, Jessica and Michael, who had initially shared our father's skepticism, but gradually came to appreciate David's thoughtful nature and obvious devotion to me. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," Linda called, and my father stepped into the room wearing his best suit and an expression I couldn't quite read. Bob Mitchell was a handsome man for 58, with silver hair and the kind of strong handshake that came from 30 years of manual labor before the hardware store took off. He'd put on weight since his high school football days, but he still carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Well," he said, looking me up and down with what I hoped was approval, "you clean up pretty nice, kiddo." It was the kind of backhanded compliment that had characterized our relationship since I'd announced my engagement. Everything was qualified, conditional, tinged with the disappointment of opportunities he felt I was squandering. Ashley and my mother took their cue to leave, gathering their purses and giving me quick kisses before heading downstairs to take their seats. Suddenly, it was just my father and me in the quiet room, sunlight streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the dust particles that danced between us like tiny question marks. "Sarah," he began, his voice taking on the tone he used for serious conversations, "I want you to know that no matter what happens today, no matter what I think about your choices, you're still my daughter." The words should have been comforting, but something in his delivery made them sound more like a warning than a blessing. "Dad," I said, stepping closer to him, "I know you have concerns about David, but I need you to trust me. I know him in ways you haven't had the chance to yet. He's a good man, and he loves me." My father nodded slowly, but his eyes held the same stubborn certainty they'd carried for months. "I hope you're right, sweetheart. I truly do. But hope doesn't pay bills or build a future. Sometimes love isn't enough." Before I could respond, the wedding planner knocked and announced that it was time. My father offered me his arm, and together we made our way to the doors that led to the main hall. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of our guests rising to their feet. Somewhere beyond those doors, David was waiting for me at an altar decorated with white roses and baby's breath, probably checking his watch and straightening his tie the way he did when he was nervous. The doors opened and the wedding march began to play. Every face in the room turned toward us, smiling and expectant. Mrs. Hayes from next door dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My high school English teacher waved from the third row. Tom Brennan, my father's best friend since childhood, raised his glass in a silent toast. This was supposed to be our moment, the culmination of 18 months of love and planning and dreaming about our future together. We were halfway down the aisle when my father suddenly stopped walking. The music continued, but something in his posture had changed. His grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there moments before. "Dad?" I whispered, confused by the sudden halt. He turned to face the assembled guests, his voice carrying clearly over the soft strings of the wedding march. "Before we go any further," he announced, "I want everyone here to know something important." The music faltered and then stopped entirely. 200 faces turned toward us with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "I raised 3 children in this town, but as of today I only have 2. The words hit me like cold water. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by a silence so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. My bouquet trembled in my hands as the full meaning of his statement sank in. He was disowning me. Here, in front of everyone we knew, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, my father was cutting me out of his family. Dad, please, I whispered, but he had already dropped my arm and stepped away from me. His face was set in the same stubborn expression he wore when he'd made up his mind about something and refused to be swayed by reason or emotion. I won't pretend to support a union that goes against everything I believe is right for my daughter, he continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Some mistakes are too big to ignore, and some choices have consequences. With that, he turned and walked back down the aisle, leaving me standing alone in my wedding dress while 200 people stared in shocked silence. The humiliation burned through me like fire. This was worse than anything I could have imagined. Not a private conversation or a heated argument behind closed doors, but a public declaration that I was no longer worthy of being called his daughter. I wanted to run, to gather up my dress and flee through the side door, to disappear from this nightmare that my wedding day had become. But then I saw David. He had stepped down from the altar and was walking toward me, his face calm and determined. There was no shock in his expression, no panic or embarrassment, just the same steady presence that had drawn me to him from the beginning. When he reached me, he gently took my arm and guided me the rest of the way down the aisle. "We'll get through this," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "Together." As we took our places at the altar, I noticed something strange. While most of the guests were still murmuring and shifting uncomfortably in their seats, a few people near the back of the room were speaking into small devices attached to their lapels. I hadn't noticed them before. These serious-faced men and women in dark suits who seemed oddly out of place among our friends and family from Riverside. The officiant, Pastor Williams from St. Mark's, looked uncertain about whether to proceed. David nodded to him encouragingly, and the ceremony resumed with a reading about love persevering through trials. As the familiar words washed over us, I tried to focus on the promises we were about to make rather than the empty space where my father should have been standing. We had just finished exchanging rings when I noticed more movement near the back of the room. Carmen Rodriguez, our wedding planner, was speaking with one of the serious-faced strangers. Even from a distance, I could see the confusion on her face as she listened to whatever he was telling her. She glanced toward the altar, then back at the man, then toward the reception area visible through the open doors to the adjacent ballroom. The final blessing was pronounced. Pastor Williams declared us husband and wife, and David kissed me to applause that sounded more relieved than celebratory. As we turned to face our guests as a married couple, I saw Carmen approaching with the stranger right behind her. She looked nervous, the way she had when we'd discussed the budget constraints, and she'd had to break the news that we couldn't afford both the upgraded flowers and the premium bar package. But this nervousness was different. This was the expression of someone who had just learned information that changed everything they thought they knew about a situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She reached us just as we were about to begin our recessional walk back down the aisle. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice professionally polite but carrying an authority that made everyone within earshot stop talking. "I need to speak with Mrs. Chen about the reception arrangements." Mrs. Chen. It took me a moment to realize he was talking about me, using my new married name. But that wasn't the part that made my heart skip a beat. It was what came next. Carmen's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden quiet of the room, everyone heard her clearly. "He's asking where Madam President should sit for the reception." The words hung in the air like a riddle waiting to be solved. Madam President? I looked at David, expecting to see the same confusion I felt, but his expression was carefully neutral. Not surprised, not confused, just watchful in a way that suggested he was waiting to see how this moment would unfold. It was then that I noticed the other changes in the room. The serious-faced strangers had positioned themselves at strategic points around the space. The catering staff was moving with an efficiency that seemed almost military in its precision, and near the entrance to the reception area, I could see more people in dark suits speaking into earpieces and checking their watches. My father, who had been making his way toward the exit, had stopped dead in his tracks. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at the man who had spoken to Carmen with an expression of dawning realization. Tom Brennan was standing next to him, his mouth slightly open, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. "David," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the growing murmur of confused conversations throughout the room. What's happening? My new husband looked at me with eyes that held both apology and determination. Sarah, he said, there are some things about my work that I haven't been able to tell you. Things that are going to become very clear very soon. Before I could ask what he meant, another man in a dark suit approached us. This one was older, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being in charge of important situations. Mrs. Chen, he said, I'm Agent Morrison with the Secret Service. We need to discuss security arrangements for the reception. Secret Service. The words echoed in my mind as I tried to process their meaning. Why would the Secret Service be at my wedding? Why would they be asking about seating arrangements for someone called Madam President? And why was David looking like he'd been expecting this conversation? The pieces started falling into place like dominoes in my mind. The remote work that couldn't be discussed. The confidentiality agreements. The vague references to government contracts. David's calm acceptance of my father's suspicions. As if he understood that the truth would eventually speak for itself. David, I said again, my voice stronger now. Who exactly did I just marry? He smiled then, the same gentle smile that had made me fall in love with him 2 years ago in Bean There Cafe. Someone who's about to start a new job, he said. A very public one. Around us, the wedding guests were beginning to understand that something extraordinary was happening. Phones were coming out as people started taking pictures and recording videos. Mrs. Hayes was staring with her mouth open. Ashley was gripping her boyfriend's arm and whispering urgently in his ear. My mother looked like she might faint. And my father, the man who had just publicly disowned me for marrying beneath the Mitchell family standards, was standing frozen in the doorway, watching his son-in-law being addressed by federal agents with the kind of respect usually reserved for heads of state. Agent Morrison was still waiting for an answer about the seating arrangements. Carmen was clutching her clipboard like a life preserver. The Secret Service detail was maintaining their professional composure, while our wedding guests gawked and whispered and tried to understand what they were witnessing. I think, David said, looking around at the controlled chaos that our reception had become, we're going to need a bigger table. The Secret Service agent's words seemed to hang in the air like a question mark made of smoke, Madam President. The phrase bounced around the reception hall, whispered from guest to guest like a children's game of telephone, each repetition adding another layer of disbelief to the already surreal atmosphere. I watched my father's face transform from stubborn righteousness to something approaching terror, as the full implications of what was happening began to register. David's hand found mine, warm and steady despite the chaos erupting around us. We should probably sit down for this conversation, he said to Agent Morrison, his voice carrying a calmness that seemed almost supernatural given the circumstances. The agent nodded and gestured toward a quieter corner of the reception area, away from the growing crowd of confused wedding guests who were now openly staring and recording everything with their phones. As we walked across the polished floor of the Oakwood Country Club, I felt like I was moving through a dream. The elegant decorations that had taken months to plan, the carefully arranged centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath, the string quartet that had resumed playing soft background music, all of it felt like props in someone else's wedding. This wasn't the intimate celebration David and I had envisioned when we'd chosen this venue 8 months ago. This was something else entirely, something that belonged in a movie or a news report, not in my actual life. Carmen Rodriguez hurried alongside us, her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. Mrs. Chen, she said, and I startled again at the unfamiliar name. I need to understand what's happening here. The catering staff is asking questions I don't know how to answer. They want to know if there are dietary restrictions for the security detail, and whether we need to adjust the bar service for additional guests. Her voice carried the professional strain of someone trying to maintain composure, while her entire understanding of an event had just been turned upside down. Agent Morrison's expression remained diplomatically neutral as he guided us to a round table near the windows overlooking the Scioto River. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass created dancing patterns on the white tablecloth, and for a moment I focused on those shifting shadows instead of the impossible conversation that was about to unfold. Other agents had quietly positioned themselves around the room, their presence now obvious once you knew to look for them. How had I missed them before? How had any of us missed the subtle signs that this was not an ordinary wedding? Mrs. Chen, Agent Morrison began, settling into his chair with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing information. "I apologize for the timing of this conversation. We had hoped to brief you privately after the ceremony, but circumstances have accelerated our timeline." He glanced toward the growing cluster of guests who were straining to overhear our conversation, their earlier shock giving way to an almost carnival-like excitement as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Briefed me about what?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would be something I wasn't prepared to hear. David's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of my hand, a gesture that was both comforting and somehow apologetic. "About your new security requirements," Agent Morrison replied. "Effective immediately, you'll be receiving full Secret Service protection as the spouse of the President-elect of the United States." The words hit me like a physical blow. President-elect. My David, the quiet man who worked from his laptop in our favorite coffee shop, who helped elderly customers load mulch into their cars at my father's hardware store, who had patiently endured months of skeptical questions from my family about his career prospects, was going to be the President of the United States. I turned to stare at my husband, searching his familiar face for some sign that this was an elaborate joke or a case of mistaken identity. But David's brown eyes held only the same gentle honesty that had drawn me to him from the beginning, along with something new, something that looked like relief mixed with apprehension. "The election," I said slowly, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed beginning to fall into place. "The election isn't for another month." "The public election," David corrected quietly. "But the Electoral College has already convened an emergency session. There were some irregularities with the originally scheduled election, some security concerns that required immediate action. The results were certified this morning." He paused, studying my face. "Sarah, I wanted to tell you. I've wanted to tell you for weeks, but there were protocols, security clearances, legal requirements that prevented me from sharing classified information, even with my wife." "Wife?" The word felt strange and new, carrying weight I hadn't anticipated when we'd exchanged vows less than an hour ago. "I was married to the President-elect of the United States. In January, David would be sworn in as the leader of the free world, and I would be the First Lady." The girl who had grown up on Maple Street in Riverside, Ohio, whose biggest ambition had been to finish her master's degree in social work and maybe run for the school board someday, was going to live in the White House. The implications crashed over me like successive waves. The media attention, the security protocols, the end of privacy as I had always known it. Every decision, every outfit, every facial expression would be scrutinized by millions of people. My quiet life of teaching part-time at the community college and volunteering at the literacy center would be replaced by state dinners and foreign policy briefings and a level of public responsibility I had never imagined. But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, another realization was taking shape. I looked across the reception hall to where my father stood frozen near the entrance, his face pale and his confident posture deflated like a punctured balloon. Bob Mitchell, who had just publicly declared that he only had 2 children, who had disowned his daughter for marrying a man he deemed unworthy of the Mitchell family name, had just learned that his son-in-law was about to become the most powerful person in the world. "How long have you known?" I asked David, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been in consideration for the emergency appointment for 6 months," he replied. "The selection committee approached me after the crisis with the original candidates. They needed someone with my background in international relations and crisis management, someone who could step in quickly if the situation demanded it." He gestured around the room, where our wedding guests were now openly gathered in clusters, their conversations animated and their phones constantly flashing as they documented this historic moment. "I found out definitively 3 weeks ago that I would be chosen, but I couldn't tell anyone until the official announcement. 3 weeks ago. Right around the time of the disastrous barbecue where my father had loudly questioned David's career prospects and declared him unsuitable for his daughter." The irony was so sharp it was almost physical. Agent Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Chen, We need to discuss the immediate changes to your security situation. As of now, you'll have a protection detail assigned to you at all times. We'll also need to conduct background checks on everyone in your immediate circle, family members, close friends, colleagues. His gaze moved meaningfully toward the crowd of wedding guests. We'll start with everyone here today. I thought about Mrs. Hayes, who had babysat me when I was 7 and my parents went to their high school reunion. I thought about Ashley, who had held my hair back when I was sick with food poisoning sophomore year of college. I thought about my students at the community college, 18-year-olds who were trying to finish their high school equivalency degrees while working full-time jobs to support their families. All of these people would now be subjected to federal background investigations because of their association with me. Carmen Rodriguez had been taking notes frantically throughout this conversation, her wedding planner instincts kicking in even as she tried to process the surreal turn the day had taken. Should I contact the kitchen about upgrading the menu? She asked. I mean, if the president-elect is having his reception here, shouldn't we be serving something more, presidential? David laughed, the first genuine moment of levity since Agent Morrison had approached us. Carmen, we specifically chose the chicken parmesan because it's Sarah's favorite comfort food. I think we can keep the menu as it is. He looked at me, his expression growing serious again. That is, if you still want to have a reception. I understand if this changes everything for you. The question hung between us, heavy with implications I was still struggling to understand. Did I want to continue with our wedding celebration now that I knew our life was about to be turned completely upside down? Did I want to spend the evening dancing and cutting cake, while Secret Service agents watched from the perimeter and my father stood in the corner grappling with the magnitude of his mistake? Before I could answer, I heard raised voices from across the room. My mother, Linda, was standing near the entrance, her navy blue dress wrinkled from gripping the fabric, her face flushed with a combination of excitement and panic. She was speaking rapidly to Tom Brennan, my father's best friend, who kept shaking his head in apparent disbelief. I don't understand what this means, my mother was saying, her voice carrying across the room despite her attempts to speak quietly. Is Sarah really going to be the First Lady? Like, living in the White House First Lady? What does this mean for us? What does this mean for Bob's business? What does this mean for our family? Tom Brennan, who had known my family since before I was born, who had helped my father build the deck behind our house when I was in middle school, looked like someone had just told him the laws of physics had been suspended. Linda, he said, his voice hoarse with shock, I think it means your daughter just became one of the most important people in America. My mother's gaze found mine across the room, and I saw in her expression the same mixture of pride and terror that I was feeling myself. Linda Mitchell had spent her entire adult life as the wife of a small business owner in a small Ohio town. She volunteered at the church bake sale, organized the neighborhood watch meetings, and knew the names of everyone who worked at the grocery store. The idea that her daughter was about to become a public figure on a global scale was as foreign to her as the idea of traveling to Mars. But it was my father's reaction that captured my attention most completely. Bob Mitchell was still standing near the entrance, but his posture had changed dramatically in the few minutes since Agent Morrison's announcement. The angry righteousness that had fueled his public declaration about having only 2 children had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like the beginning of understanding just how catastrophically he had misjudged the situation. David followed my gaze and seemed to read my thoughts. Do you want to talk to him? He asked gently. I considered the question. Part of me wanted to march over to my father and demand an apology, to make him acknowledge the magnitude of his mistake in front of all the same people who had witnessed his cruel rejection. Part of me wanted to ignore him completely, to let him stand there and marinate in his own embarrassment, while I celebrated the most important day of my life with the people who actually supported my choices. But there was another part of me, the part that remembered being 8 years old and helping my father organize inventory at the hardware store, that wanted to bridge the gap his pride had created. Because despite everything that had happened, despite the public humiliation and the stubborn prejudice, Bob Mitchell was still my father. And in a few months, when David took the oath of office, our family dynamics were going to become exponentially more complicated. Not yet, I said finally. Let him process this first. Let him figure out how he wants to handle what just happened. Agent Morrison had been speaking quietly into his earpiece during our conversation, and now he turned back to us with an expression that suggested new complications. Mrs. Chen, we have another situation developing. It appears that word of today's events is beginning to spread beyond this room. Social media posts from your guests are starting to gain traction, and we're seeing increased interest from news outlets. As if on cue, my phone began buzzing with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, social media alerts, all flooding in at once as the reality of our situation began to penetrate the wider world. Ashley hurried over to our table, her own phone in her hand, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Sarah," she said breathlessly, "you need to see this." Someone posted a video of the ceremony on TikTok, and it's already got 50,000 views. The comments are insane. People are trying to figure out who David is, and some of them are getting close to the truth. She showed me her phone screen, where a shaky video of my father's declaration and the subsequent Secret Service intervention was playing on repeat. The caption read, "Wedding takes insane turn when bride's dad disowns her, then Secret Service shows up?" Quote. And the comments section was filling with increasingly wild speculation about David's identity and the reason for federal intervention at a wedding in small-town Ohio. David and Agent Morrison exchanged a look that spoke of contingency plans and protocol adjustments. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Agent Morrison said. "The original plan was to make the official announcement tomorrow morning, but if the story is already breaking, we may need to get ahead of it." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve more disruption to what was supposed to be our quiet wedding day. "It means," David said, reaching for my hand again, "that we might be giving our first joint press conference sooner than expected." Press conference. The words sent a new wave of anxiety through me. I had never given a press conference. I had never even been interviewed by a reporter. My most significant public speaking experience had been reading a poem at my college graduation. And now I was going to have to stand in front of cameras and microphones and explain to the world how I had managed to marry the president-elect without knowing it myself. Carmen Rodriguez, who had been frantically scribbling notes throughout this entire conversation, suddenly looked up with an expression of professional determination. "If we're potentially dealing with media attention tonight," she said, "I need to make some immediate adjustments to the reception setup. We'll need to control access, establish clear sight lines, and probably relocate the cake cutting to a more secure area." The cake cutting. In all the chaos and revelation, I had almost forgotten about the 3-tiered vanilla cake with buttercream roses that was waiting in the adjacent room. The cake that David and I had tasted and selected during a date that now felt like it had happened in a different lifetime. The normalcy of the tradition seemed almost absurd in the context of everything else that was happening. "I don't want to cancel the reception," I said suddenly, the words surprising me as much as they seemed to surprise everyone else at the table. "I know everything has changed, and I know our life is about to become public property, but right now, in this moment, I want to celebrate marrying the man I love, even if he happens to be the president-elect." David's smile was radiant, the kind of expression that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. "Then we celebrate," he said. "We eat the chicken parmesan, we dance to the playlist you spent weeks putting together, and we cut the cake that we chose because it reminded you of your grandmother's recipe." Agent Morrison nodded approvingly. "We can work with that. We'll establish a security perimeter, limit access to pre-approved guests only, and monitor the situation closely. But Mrs. Chen," he paused meaningfully, "this is likely the last private celebration you'll have for quite some time." The weight of that statement settled over me like a blanket. After tonight, every meal would be scrutinized, every guest list would be vetted, every public appearance would be choreographed and analyzed. This reception, chaotic and surreal as it had become, was my farewell to anonymity. I looked around the room at the faces of everyone I cared about. My mother was now sitting with Mrs. Hayes, both of them looking like they were trying to solve a complicated math problem. Jessica and Michael, my siblings, were huddled together near the bar, their expressions cycling between amazement and concern as they tried to understand what their sister's new status would mean for their own lives. Ashley was still clutching her phone, apparently live texting updates to someone about the most dramatic wedding in Ohio history. And my father was still standing by the entrance, his face now completely drained of color as the full magnitude of his mistake became undeniable. Bob Mitchell, who had built his identity around being the most successful, most respected member of the Mitchell family, had just publicly rejected the daughter who was about to become one of the most prominent women in America. The irony was so complete, it was almost poetic. The man who had worried about our family's reputation had just damaged it in the most public way possible, and the son-in-law he had deemed unworthy was about to elevate our family name to heights Bob Mitchell had never imagined. But even as I recognized the cosmic justice of the situation, I felt a pang of sadness for my father. This was supposed to be a day of joy and celebration, a day when our families came together to support David and me as we began our married life. Instead, it had become a day of reckoning, a day when Bob Mitchell's prejudices and assumptions had collided with reality in the most spectacular way possible. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Morrison said, interrupting my thoughts, "we should discuss the immediate logistics. We'll need to know where you're planning to spend tonight, and we'll need to establish security protocols for your residence going forward." Our residence. David and I had planned to spend our wedding night at the small bed and breakfast downtown, then drive to Lake Erie for a long weekend honeymoon at a cabin that had been in David's family for generations. Simple plans, intimate plans, the kind of low-key celebration that suited our personalities and our budget. But nothing about our life was going to be simple anymore. "The bed and breakfast might not be the best option," David said diplomatically. "I suspect we're going to need somewhere with more security capabilities." As if summoned by his words, another agent appeared at our table. This one was younger, with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was accustomed to managing complex logistical challenges. "Sir," she said to David, "we've prepared alternate accommodation options for tonight. There's a secure location about 30 minutes from here that can provide the privacy you need while we establish longer-term arrangements. Longer-term arrangements. Everything about our life was now going to require arrangements, protocols, security clearances, advance planning. The spontaneous date nights, the quiet dinners at hole-in-the-wall restaurants, the ability to simply decide to take a walk without consulting anyone, all of that was ending tonight. I looked at David, this man I had married without knowing the full truth about who he was, and felt a surge of something between admiration and vertigo. He had carried this secret for months, had endured my father's skepticism and my family's questions, had planned our wedding while knowing that everything would change the moment his identity was revealed. The strength that had required, the compartmentalization, the faith that our love could survive such a dramatic revelation, all of it spoke to a depth of character I was still discovering. "Are you ready for this?" I asked him, the question encompassing everything from the immediate chaos of our reception to the years of public service that lay ahead. "I'm ready for anything as long as you're with me," he replied, and despite everything that had happened, despite the agents and the protocols and the complete upheaval of every plan we had made, I believed him. Around us, the reception was beginning to take on a surreal quality. Our guests were adapting to the presence of the Secret Service, with the kind of resilient pragmatism that characterized small-town Midwesterners. Mrs. Hayes was chatting with one of the younger agents about her grandson who was considering a career in law enforcement. The string quartet had resumed playing, apparently deciding that background music was appropriate, regardless of the historical significance of the event they were soundtrack. The revelation that David was the president-elect had sent shockwaves through the reception, but it was the smaller moments that revealed the true depth of who he was. I watched him navigate the chaos with a grace I was only beginning to understand, speaking quietly with Agent Morrison about security protocols, while simultaneously reassuring Carmen about the reception timeline and checking on elderly Mrs. Hayes, who looked overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of federal agents at what she had expected to be a simple small-town wedding. It was Ashley who first told me about the library incident. She pulled me aside near the windows overlooking the river, where the late afternoon light was beginning to soften into evening gold. "Sarah," she said, her voice filled with a wonder I had never heard before. "Do you remember when the community college was trying to cut the literacy program last year? When they said there wasn't funding for adult education services?" I nodded, remembering the heated school board meetings and the passionate speeches from students who were trying to finish their high school equivalency degrees. The program meant everything to people like Maria Gonzalez, who was working 2 jobs while trying to get her diploma so she could qualify for nursing school, and Robert Taylor, a veteran who had struggled with reading his entire life and was finally getting the help he needed. David was there, Ashley continued, not just at the meetings but behind the scenes. He worked with the state education department to secure emergency funding, and when that wasn't enough, he personally contacted private foundations until he found the grants that saved the program. She paused, watching my expression carefully. He never told you, did he? He hadn't told me. David had listened to me vent about the potential cuts, had comforted me when I worried about my students losing their only chance at educational advancement, had even attended one of the public meetings where parents and students pleaded their case to an unsympathetic school board, but he had never mentioned his own involvement in the solution that had seemed to appear out of nowhere just when the situation looked hopeless. There's more, Ashley said softly. The Veterans Housing Project that got approved last month? The one everyone said would never get through the city council because of NIMBY opposition? David was instrumental in that too. He brought in federal housing experts who testified about the need, and somehow convinced 3 council members who had been adamantly opposed to change their votes. I stared at my husband across the room, where he was now speaking with my brother Michael, his calm presence somehow managing to put my clearly overwhelmed sibling at ease. How many other quiet interventions had David made in our community? How many problems had he solved without fanfare, without credit, without anyone ever knowing that the mild-mannered man with the laptop was actually moving mountains behind the scenes? He's been preparing, I realized aloud, not just for the presidency, but for this specific community. He's been learning about us, caring about us, investing in us. The implications were staggering. David hadn't chosen Riverside randomly when he'd moved here 2 years ago. He had come here with intention, with purpose, with a plan to understand the needs of small-town America from the ground up. Mrs. Hayes appeared at my elbow, her weathered face bright with excitement, despite the surreal circumstances. "Sarah, dear," she said, patting my arm with the familiarity of someone who had known me since childhood, "I just want you to know how proud your grandmother would have been. She always said you were destined for something special, though I don't think even she imagined it would be quite this special." The mention of my grandmother brought tears to my eyes. Eleanor Mitchell had died 3 years ago, but her influence on my life had been immeasurable. She had been the one to encourage my interest in social work, the one who had taught me that true service meant lifting others up, rather than climbing over them. She would have loved David, I realized, with sudden certainty. She would have seen past his quiet demeanor to the depth of his commitment to making life better for ordinary people. She would have liked him, I said to Mrs. Hayes, who nodded knowingly. "Oh, she did like him," Mrs. Hayes replied, surprising me. "She met him, you know, before she passed. He came to see her at the nursing home, not long after he moved to town. They talked for hours about community development and rural healthcare initiatives. She told me afterward that Riverside had gained someone very special, though she made me promise not to tell anyone about their conversation. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. David had known my grandmother. He had sought her out, had listened to her concerns about our community, had valued her wisdom enough to spend hours in conversation with a woman most people saw simply as an elderly resident of Sunset Manor. The respect that gesture represented, the humility it demonstrated, painted a picture of my husband that I was still learning to see clearly. "What did they talk about?" I asked, hungry for any connection between the 2 most important people in my life. Mrs. Hayes smiled with the contentment of someone sharing a treasured memory. "Rural hospital closures, mainly. Your grandmother was so worried about what would happen when Riverside General inevitably shut down like so many small-town hospitals have." David listened to every word, asked thoughtful questions, took notes. He promised her he would look into federal programs that might help. She paused meaningfully. 3 months later, Riverside General received a surprise federal grant that ensured its survival for the next decade. The pattern was becoming undeniable. David hadn't just been living in our community for the past 2 years. He had been studying it, understanding it, quietly working to address its challenges. The man my father had dismissed as an unemployed drifter had actually been conducting the most thorough ground-level research into small-town American needs that any presidential candidate had probably ever undertaken. Across the room, I could see my father still standing near the entrance, his face cycling through emotions as various guests approached him with congratulations and barely concealed amazement. Tom Brennan was beside him, apparently trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened to his best friend's family. Bob Mitchell looked like a man who had just discovered that the lottery ticket he had thrown away was actually worth millions of dollars. But it was the arrival of David's mother that truly began to reveal the scope of what I had married into. Helen Chen entered the reception hall with the kind of quiet dignity that immediately commanded attention without demanding it. She was a small woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and wearing a simple but beautifully tailored navy dress. What struck me most was her complete lack of surprise at the chaos surrounding her son's wedding reception. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Morrison said, approaching her with the same respectful deference he had shown David, "thank you for arriving so quickly. We're still establishing security protocols for the family." "Helen is fine," she replied with a warm smile that reminded me powerfully of David's. "And I appreciate your thoroughness, Agent Morrison, but I've been living with security considerations for longer than you might think." She embraced David, then turned to me with eyes that held both welcome and sympathy. "Sarah, dear, I'm so sorry you had to learn about all this in such a public way. David wanted to tell you sooner, but the circumstances made it impossible." "You knew," I said, not accusingly but with dawning understanding. "You've known all along what was going to happen." Helen nodded, her expression gentle but serious. "David has been preparing for this possibility for over a year. The selection committee identified him as a potential emergency candidate after the original nominees encountered their difficulties. They needed someone with his specific combination of experience and integrity, someone who could step in immediately if the situation required it." She gestured around the room, where our wedding guests were still adapting to the presence of federal agents and the gradually spreading realization that they were witnessing history. "This isn't how we had hoped the announcement would happen, but David insisted on maintaining as much normalcy as possible for as long as possible. He wanted your wedding day to be about your love, not about his career." The thoughtfulness of that gesture, the protection David had tried to provide for what should have been our most intimate celebration, made my heart ache with gratitude and loss simultaneously. He had sacrificed the ability to share his excitement, his nervousness, his hopes for our future together, because he had wanted to preserve the purity of our wedding day. "The remote work," I said, pieces continuing to fall into place. "The confidentiality agreements, the government contracts." "Transition team meetings," Helen confirmed. "Policy briefings, security clearance interviews, cabinet selection consultations." David has been functioning as president-elect in all but name for weeks, preparing for an announcement that was supposed to happen after your honeymoon. The sacrifice that represented began to sink in. While I had been worrying about flower arrangements and seating charts, David had been preparing to lead the nation through whatever crisis had necessitated an emergency presidential selection. While I had been stressed about whether my father would behave himself at the reception, David had been receiving briefings on national security threats and international relations challenges. Carmen Rodriguez appeared at our small gathering, her professional composure now fully restored despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Mrs. Chen," she said, addressing me with a new level of formality that would apparently be my reality going forward, "we're ready to begin the dinner service whenever you're comfortable. The kitchen staff has been briefed on the security requirements, and Agent Morrison has approved the service protocols." The idea of sitting down to eat chicken parmesan while Secret Service agents watched from the perimeter seemed surreal, but I was beginning to understand that surreal was going to be the new normal for our lives. "Is the head table still set up as we planned?" I asked, thinking about the careful arrangement that would have seated my parents beside David's mother, with my siblings and our closest friends filling out the rest of the table. Carmen's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. "Well, we may need to make some adjustments to the seating arrangement, given the, circumstances with your father's earlier announcement." I looked across the room to where Bob Mitchell was still standing with Tom Brennan, his face now wearing an expression of such profound regret that it was almost painful to witness. The man who had declared in front of 200 people that he only had 2 children was now faced with the reality that his 3rd child was about to become one of the most prominent women in America. "No," I said firmly, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. "The seating arrangement stays as planned. If my father chooses to take his assigned seat, he's welcome. If he chooses to leave, that's his decision. But I'm not going to rearrange my wedding reception around his mistake." David, who had been speaking quietly with Agent Morrison, rejoined our group just in time to hear my declaration. His smile was proud and slightly relieved. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "Whatever happens with your father, this is still our wedding day, and we should celebrate it the way we planned." Helen Chen nodded approvingly. "Your grandmother would be proud of that decision," she said, and I realized that David had told his mother about his conversations with Eleanor Mitchell. The connections were deeper than I had understood, the planning more thorough, the respect for our community more genuine than I had imagined. As if summoned by our conversation about the dinner service, the string quartet transitioned into a softer melody that Carmen had designated as the cue for guests to find their seats. Around the room, people began moving toward the tables, their conversations animated with the kind of energy that comes from being present at a historic moment. I could see phones being discreetly positioned to capture photos, and I realized that our wedding reception was probably being live-streamed to social media platforms by multiple guests simultaneously. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Morrison said, appearing beside us with the efficient timing that seemed to characterize everything about the Secret Service. "We should discuss media protocols. The story is spreading rapidly online, and we're receiving inquiries from major news outlets. The communications team suggests that we may want to consider a brief statement tonight rather than allowing speculation to build overnight." A statement. My first official communication as the wife of the president-elect would be delivered at my own wedding reception, surrounded by chicken parmesan and white roses and the friends and family who had come to celebrate what they thought would be a simple small-town wedding. "What would that involve?" David asked, his hand finding mine in the gesture of support that was becoming our anchor in this storm of change. "Something brief and personal," Agent Morrison replied. "An acknowledgement of the day's events, appreciation for the support of your community, perhaps a word about your commitment to serving the American people. Nothing elaborate, just a way to get ahead of the narrative before it gets away from us entirely." I thought about Maria Gonzalez and Robert Taylor and all the other students in my literacy classes, people who were working so hard to build better lives for themselves and their families. I thought about Mrs. Hayes and the concerns she and my grandmother had shared about rural health care and economic opportunity. I thought about the veterans who would benefit from David's housing initiative and the families who were struggling to make ends meet in a changing economy. These were the people David would be serving as president, the people whose needs had guided his quiet work in our community for the past 2 years. If I was going to make my first public statement as a future First Lady, it should be about them, about the America that existed in small towns like Riverside, where people knew their neighbors and cared about each other's success. "I'll do it," I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. "But I want to do it here, at our reception, with our community around us. These are the people who shaped us, who supported us, who represent the America we want to serve." David's smile was radiant. "That's perfect," he said. "That's exactly what the country needs to hear." Agent Morrison nodded approvingly. "We can set up a small area near the windows, use the natural light for filming. Keep it intimate but professional. The communications team can have a statement prepared within the hour." "No prepared statement," I said, surprising myself again with my certainty. "If I'm going to speak as Sarah Chen, future First Lady, then I want my first words to be my own. I want to talk about this community, about the people here, about what David has learned from living and working in Riverside." I paused, looking around the room at the faces of everyone who had shaped my life. "I want to talk about small-town American values and why they matter to our future." The decision felt right in a way that nothing else had since Agent Morrison had first approached us. This wasn't about political messaging or communication strategy. This was about authenticity, about representing the real experiences of real people, about using this unprecedented platform to shine a light on the communities that too often felt forgotten by Washington politics. As guests began settling into their seats for dinner, I could see my father still hesitating near the entrance. Tom Brennan was speaking to him urgently, occasionally gesturing toward our head table where his assigned seat remained empty. Bob Mitchell's face was a study in internal conflict, pride warring with regret, stubbornness battling with the dawning realization of the magnitude of his error. "He's going to have to decide," I said to David, watching my father struggle. "I can't make this choice for him." "No," David agreed. "But whatever he decides, we'll handle it together. That's what marriage means, even when marriage suddenly includes the White House." The White House. In all the immediate chaos and emotion, I hadn't really processed that part of our new reality. In less than 4 months, David and I would be living in the most famous house in America, hosting foreign dignitaries and managing state dinners and representing the United States to the world. The girl who had grown up in a 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street was going to wake up every morning in the residence that had housed Lincoln and Roosevelt and Kennedy. "Are you scared?" I asked David quietly, the question encompassing everything from the immediate media attention to the enormous responsibilities he was about to shoulder. "Terrified," he admitted with characteristic honesty, "but also excited and grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to serve. Grateful for this community that taught me so much about real leadership. And grateful beyond words that you're willing to take this journey with me." Across the room, Carmen was signaling that dinner service was ready to begin. The Secret Service agents had positioned themselves discreetly around the perimeter of the room. Our guests were seated and waiting, their faces bright with anticipation and residual amazement at the day's revelations. Everything was ready for us to begin the first official meal of our married life, the first dinner of what would be an extraordinary presidential partnership. Everything was ready except for the empty chair at our head table, the seat that should have been occupied by my father but remained vacant as Bob Mitchell continued his internal struggle near the entrance. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The man who had worried so much about his family's reputation that he had publicly disowned his daughter was now faced with the choice of claiming his place at the table with the future President and First Lady of the United States. As David and I walked toward our seats, I found myself hoping that my father would find the courage to join us, not because I needed his approval or his presence to validate my choices, but because forgiveness is easier than carrying grudges, and because this day had already been extraordinary enough without adding the permanent estrangement of my father to its legacy. The empty chair waited, a question mark in white satin, a final invitation for Bob Mitchell to choose between his pride and his love for his daughter. The choice was his to make, but the table was set for him if he found the courage to claim it. The dinner service had just begun when I noticed the shift in energy near the entrance. My father was walking toward our table with slow, deliberate steps, his face bearing an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't the stubborn righteousness that had characterized his earlier behavior, nor was it the shocked bewilderment that had followed Agent Morrison's revelation. This was something different entirely, something that looked like a man who had just glimpsed the true cost of his pride. Bob Mitchell approached our head table where David and I sat with Helen Chen, Ashley, and my siblings Jessica and Michael. The empty chair beside my mother Linda seemed to grow larger with each step he took, its white satin cushion reflecting the chandelier light like a beacon of possibility. Every conversation in the room gradually quieted as our guests realized what was happening, that they were about to witness either a reconciliation or a final, devastating rejection played out in front of 200 people and an unknown number of social media viewers. When my father reached our table, he stopped behind the empty chair but didn't immediately sit down. Instead, he looked directly at David with an expression that seemed to be searching for something, some indication of how he should proceed in a situation that had no precedent in his experience. David, with the diplomatic grace that I was beginning to understand had been refined through months of high-level political preparation, simply nodded toward the chair in silent invitation. "Son," my father said, the word carrying weight that seemed to surprise even him, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I can express in words." His voice was steady but thick with emotion, pitched low enough to be intimate but clear enough that everyone at nearby tables could hear. I judged you based on my own limited understanding of success and worth, and in doing so, I revealed more about my own character than I did about yours. David stood, extending his hand toward my father with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the day's chaos. Bob, he said, we all make judgments based on the information we have. What matters is what we do when we learn we were wrong. The handshake that followed lasted longer than protocol would typically require, and I could see in my father's face the beginning of understanding just how profoundly he had misjudged the man his daughter had chosen to marry. Bob Mitchell was a proud man, accustomed to being respected as a pillar of the community, and the humility required to admit such a fundamental error in front of so many people was clearly costing him dearly. Sarah, my father said, turning to me with eyes that held tears he was working hard to contain. I've spent the last hour trying to find words that could somehow undo what I said during the ceremony, but I'm beginning to understand that there aren't any. I declared that I only had 2 children, and in doing so, I revealed that I had forgotten what it means to be a father. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle clinking of glasses as servers continued their work, and the soft murmur of conversations at distant tables where guests were straining to hear our family's private reconciliation. I could feel the attention of everyone in the room, the awareness that this moment would be remembered and retold, analyzed and discussed, for years to come. Dad, I said, rising from my chair to face him directly, being a father means more than just declaring your children worthy of your approval. It means trusting them to make their own choices, supporting them when those choices lead to challenges, and loving them regardless of whether their path matches your expectations. My father nodded, the gesture heavy with acknowledgement of his failure. I let my fear for your future cloud my judgment about your present. I was so worried about protecting you from what I saw as a mistake that I became the thing you needed protection from. He paused, glancing around the room at the faces of friends and neighbors who had known our family for decades. I spent my whole life building a reputation in this community, and in one moment of stubborn pride, I nearly threw away the relationship that mattered most. Helen Chen, who had been observing this exchange with the quiet attention of someone accustomed to navigating delicate family dynamics, spoke for the first time since my father's approach. Bob, she said gently, if it helps at all, David was terrified to meet you. He spent weeks preparing for your questions, worrying about whether he would measure up to your standards for Sarah's husband. He has tremendous respect for the family that raised such an extraordinary woman. The revelation that David had been nervous about meeting my father, that the future president of the United States had spent time worrying about impressing a small-town hardware store owner, seemed to hit Bob Mitchell like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he looked at David again, his expression held a mixture of gratitude and regret that was painful to witness. I wish I had given you the chance to show me who you really are, my father said to David. Instead, I created tests you couldn't pass because I never explained what I was looking for. Standards that were based on appearances rather than character. David's response was characteristically gracious. Bob, you were protecting your daughter. That's what good fathers do. The circumstances made it impossible for me to be completely open about my situation, and I understand how that must have appeared to someone who values honesty and straightforwardness. The diplomacy of the response was masterful, acknowledging my father's concerns while gently pointing out the impossible position David had been in. He couldn't have been transparent about his role as president-elect without violating national security protocols, but he also couldn't explain his secrecy without revealing classified information. My father had been judging him by standards that were impossible to meet given the extraordinary circumstances. As my father finally took his seat at our table, I could see the visible relief on my mother's face. Linda Mitchell had been caught between her husband's disapproval and her own growing affection for David, a position that had become increasingly untenable as the wedding approached. Now, with Bob's public reconciliation, she was free to express the warmth and excitement that she had been suppressing for months. David, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. I want you to know how sorry I am for not speaking up more forcefully when Bob was being unfair to you. I should have been a better advocate for my daughter's choice and a better mother-in-law to you. The apology seemed to unlock something in the atmosphere around our table. Jessica and Michael, who had been watching the family drama unfold with expressions of fascination and concern, suddenly began peppering David with questions about his new role and what it would mean for our family. The conversation that followed was animated and genuine, the kind of getting-to-know-you discussion that should have been happening for months but had been prevented by my father's stubborn resistance. It was during this conversation that Tom Brennan approached our table, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. Tom had been my father's best friend since high school, a successful contractor who had built half the houses in Riverside's newer developments, and his opinion had always carried significant weight with Bob Mitchell. "Bob," Tom said, clapping his hand on my father's shoulder, "I just wanted to tell you that you raised one hell of a daughter. Smart enough to see past appearances to character, strong enough to stand by her convictions when everyone was questioning them, and wise enough to choose a man who's going to change the world for the better." The endorsement from his oldest friend seemed to provide my father with the external validation he needed to fully embrace his change of heart. Bob Mitchell straightened in his chair, and when he looked at me, his expression held the same pride I remembered from my college graduation, the same unconditional love that had characterized our relationship before David's arrival had triggered his protective instincts. Carmen Rodriguez appeared at our table with the efficiency that had made her Riverside's most sought-after event coordinator. "Mrs. Chen," she said, "the media team is ready whenever you'd like to make your statement. They've set up a small area near the windows where the lighting is optimal, and Agent Morrison has approved the security arrangements." The prospect of my first public statement as the future First Lady sent a fresh wave of nervousness through me, but I was beginning to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. I looked around the table at my family, now complete again with my father's return, and at David, whose calm presence continued to anchor me in the midst of this extraordinary day. "I'd like all of you to be there," I said, addressing my parents and siblings. "This statement isn't just about David and me. It's about the community that shaped us, the values that guide us, and the family that supports us." I paused, looking directly at my father. All of us. Together. The setup for the media statement was more elaborate than I had expected, despite Carmen's assurances that it would be simple and intimate. Professional cameras had appeared from somewhere, along with lighting equipment that transformed the corner near the windows into what looked like a television studio. Agent Morrison consulted with technicians, while other Secret Service agents maintained their discreet but vigilant presence around the perimeter of the operation. As I took my position in front of the cameras, with David beside me and our families arranged behind us, I could see our wedding guests gathered at a respectful distance, their faces bright with excitement at being present for what they understood was a historic moment. Mrs. Hayes had somehow managed to position herself in the front row of onlookers, her expression radiating the kind of pride that grandmothers reserve for their most exceptional grandchildren. The communications director, a crisp professional woman who had materialized from David's transition team, approached with a tablet containing talking points and suggested statements. "Mrs. Chen," she said, "we've prepared some remarks that touch on the key themes you mentioned. Family values, community support, commitment to service." I looked at the screen filled with carefully crafted phrases and political messaging, then handed the tablet back to her with a polite smile. "Thank you, but I'd prefer to speak from my heart rather than from a script. This is my community, my family, my story. I think I can tell it better than anyone else." The decision clearly made the communications director nervous, but David's supportive nod gave me the confidence to trust my instincts. When the cameras began recording, I found myself looking not at the lenses but at the faces of the people who had gathered to witness this moment. These were my neighbors, my friends, the people who had shaped my understanding of what it means to be part of a community that cares for its members. "Good evening," I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. "My name is Sarah Chen, and until this afternoon I was simply Sarah Mitchell from Riverside, Ohio. I taught literacy classes at the community college, volunteered at the food bank, and worried about the same things that concern families all across small-town America. Healthcare costs, educational opportunities, economic stability, and whether our children would have the chance to build good lives in the communities that raised them." I paused, glancing at David, whose encouraging smile reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. Today I learned that the man I married, the man I chose because of his kindness, his integrity, and his quiet commitment to making life better for others, is going to be the next president of the United States. But what I want you to know is that those qualities, the ones that made me fall in love with David Chen, are the same qualities that led to his selection for this enormous responsibility. The response from our gathered guests was immediate and heartfelt, a combination of applause and murmurs of approval that spoke to their genuine affection for both David and me. I could see my father's face in the crowd, his expression now radiating the kind of pride that he had been unable to express earlier, the recognition that his daughter had indeed chosen well. For the past 2 years, David has been living in our community, learning from us, listening to our concerns, and quietly working to address the challenges we face. He helped save our literacy program when it was threatened by budget cuts. He worked behind the scenes to secure funding for our veterans' housing project. He spent hours with my grandmother, listening to her wisdom about rural healthcare and community development. He didn't do these things because he was running for office or seeking recognition. He did them because he believes that good leadership starts with understanding the real needs of real people. I could see phones throughout the crowd, recording my words for immediate sharing on social media platforms, and I realized that this message was already reaching far beyond the confines of our reception hall. Somewhere out there, people in communities like ours were hearing about a presidential candidate who had taken the time to understand their struggles, who had invested in their success, who saw them as partners in building a better America rather than simply voters to be courted during election cycles. David chose Riverside not as a political strategy, but as a way of life. He wanted to understand what it means to be part of a community where people know each other's names, where neighbors help neighbors, where success is measured not just by personal achievement, but by collective well-being. These are the values he'll bring to the presidency. The understanding that America's strength comes from communities like ours, from families like yours, from the everyday heroes who make our country work. The emotion in the room was palpable, a sense of pride and ownership that came from being recognized and valued by someone who would soon hold the highest office in the land. I could see tears in Mrs. Hayes' eyes, the kind of tears that come from feeling truly seen and appreciated after years of being overlooked by politicians who saw small towns as campaign stops rather than communities worthy of investment and respect. As I stand here today, surrounded by the people who raised me and shaped me, I want to make a promise. When David and I move to Washington, we won't forget where we came from, or what we learned here. We'll carry the voice of small-town America into the highest levels of government, and we'll work every day to ensure that communities like Riverside have the resources, the opportunities, and the support they need to thrive. I looked directly into the camera, understanding that my words were now reaching a national audience. To everyone watching, whether you're in Ohio or California, whether you live in a small town or a big city, whether you voted for my husband or supported someone else, I want you to know that David and I see this presidency as an opportunity to serve all Americans. We'll work to bridge the divides that separate us, to find common ground in our shared values, and to build a future that works for everyone. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, not the polite clapping of a formal event, but the enthusiastic response of people who felt genuinely represented and hopeful about the future. As the cameras stopped recording and the media equipment began to be packed away, I found myself surrounded by friends and neighbors, offering congratulations and expressions of support that felt deeply personal rather than political. It was Mrs. Hayes who said what everyone seemed to be thinking. "Sarah, dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "your grandmother always said you were destined for something special, but I don't think even she imagined you'd end up as First Lady. She would be so proud of the woman you've become, and the man you chose to stand beside." The evening that followed took on a dreamlike quality, surreal in its normalcy despite the extraordinary circumstances. We ate the chicken parmesan that David and I had selected during a casual date months earlier. We danced to the playlist I had spent weeks perfecting, and we cut the 3-tiered cake that had been chosen because it reminded me of my grandmother's recipe. The presence of Secret Service agents and the knowledge that our reception was being live-streamed to millions of viewers couldn't diminish the fundamental joy of celebrating our love with the people who mattered most to us. My father's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the evening. The man who had publicly disowned me hours earlier was now actively engaging David in conversations about policy and governance, asking thoughtful questions about healthcare reform and rural development that revealed both his genuine interest and his growing respect for his new son-in-law. The change wasn't just superficial. It was the kind of fundamental shift that comes from recognizing and confronting your own mistakes. During the father-daughter dance, a tradition I had thought was lost forever after his earlier declaration, Bob Mitchell spoke quietly in my ear as we moved slowly around the dance floor. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I spent so much time worrying about your future that I forgot to trust your judgment about your present. You chose better than I ever could have imagined, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." The apology was simple but complete, the kind of acknowledgement that allows relationships to heal and move forward. "Dad," I replied, "the most important thing is that you're here now, that you chose love over pride, family over reputation, understanding over stubbornness. That's the kind of courage I want to take with me to Washington." As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, each offering congratulations and promises to follow our journey in the White House, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in the span of a single day. I had begun the morning as Sarah Mitchell, small-town teacher and community volunteer, planning a quiet wedding celebration with my family and friends. I was ending it as Sarah Chen, future First Lady of the United States, married to a man whose hidden depths continued to amaze me. The last dance was played as the October sun finally set behind the hills surrounding Riverside, casting long shadows across the reception hall, where we had celebrated not just a wedding but a reconciliation, a revelation, and the beginning of what promised to be an extraordinary chapter in American political history. David and I swayed together on the nearly empty dance floor, surrounded by the detritus of our reception and the quiet efficiency of Secret Service agents preparing for our departure. "No regrets?" David asked softly, his arms tightening around me as we moved to music that seemed to be playing just for us. I looked around the room at the faces of the people who had stayed until the very end, my parents dancing together with a contentment I hadn't seen in months, Ashley and her boyfriend sharing quiet conversation with Helen Chen, Mrs. Hayes directing the cleanup with the authority of someone who had organized countless community events over the decades. This was my world, our world, the foundation upon which we would build whatever came next. "No regrets," I confirmed, meaning it completely. "Just gratitude. Gratitude for this community that shaped us, for the family that supports us, and for the love that brought us together, even when the path seemed impossible." As we left the Oakwood Country Club that night, driving away in a motorcade that included more vehicles than Riverside typically saw in a month, I carried with me not just the memory of our wedding day, but the understanding that we were embarking on a journey that would test everything we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. The girl from Maple Street was about to become one of the most scrutinized women in the world, but she was taking with her the values and the love that had made the journey possible. The empty chair at our head table had been filled, the family reconciled, the community celebrated, and the future, uncertain as it was, faced together. Whatever challenges lay ahead in Washington, whatever scrutiny and pressure awaited us in the White House, we would meet them as we had met this day, with honesty, with grace, and with the unshakable foundation of a love that had proven strong enough to survive even the most extraordinary of revelations. The morning after our wedding brought the first real taste of what our new life would entail. I woke up in a secure government facility about 40 minutes outside of Riverside, a place that looked like an upscale hotel from the outside but felt like a cross between a military base and a luxury resort on the inside. David was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and a stack of briefing folders that had appeared overnight, as if delivered by some invisible federal fairy godmother. "Good morning, Madam President," I said softly, testing out the title that would become his reality in just a few months. David looked up with a smile that held both joy and apprehension. "Good morning, Mrs. First Lady," he replied, setting aside the briefing materials to give me his full attention. "How does it feel to wake up as one of the most famous people in America?" The question wasn't rhetorical. Overnight, our wedding reception had become a viral sensation. Ashley had texted me screenshots throughout the early morning hours, showing the video of my father's declaration and the subsequent Secret Service revelation, climbing toward millions of views across multiple platforms. News outlets that had never heard of Riverside, Ohio, were now running feature stories about the small town that had unknowingly hosted the wedding of the president-elect. Surreal, I admitted, checking my phone to find hundreds of missed calls and thousands of text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Also terrifying. And strangely exciting. I looked at the briefing materials David had been reviewing. What's the damage assessment? Surprisingly positive, actually, David said, his relief evident. Your statement last night is being praised across the political spectrum as authentic and heartfelt. The story of our relationship, your work in the community, your father's initial reaction and eventual reconciliation, it's all being framed as a very human story about love triumphing over prejudice and misunderstanding. He handed me a tablet, displaying news coverage from the major networks. The headlines ranged from small-town wedding becomes historic moment to president-elect's wife delivers powerful message about American values to father's public apology shows power of love over pride. Reading through the articles, I was struck by how many of them focused not on the political implications of David's selection, but on the personal story of our relationship and the community that had shaped us both. There's more, David continued, scrolling to show me social media trends. The hashtag Riverside Values is trending nationally. People are sharing stories about their own small towns, their own family reconciliations, their own experiences with judging others too quickly. Your grandmother's nursing home has been flooded with flowers and cards from people who were moved by the story of her influence on both of us. The thought of strangers sending flowers to Sunset Manor in memory of a woman they had never met, but whose wisdom had touched them through our story, brought tears to my eyes. Eleanor Mitchell would have been amazed to know that her conversations with David about rural health care and community development had ultimately reached millions of people and inspired them to reflect on their own relationships and values. Agent Morrison appeared in our suite with the punctuality that I was beginning to understand, characterized everything about the Secret Service. Mrs. Chen, he said, we need to discuss your security protocols going forward. Starting today, you'll have a permanent detail assigned to you, and will need to establish secure transportation and communication systems for your daily activities. The reality of what that meant was still sinking in. I would never again be able to simply walk out my front door and drive to the grocery store. Every trip to the community college where I taught would require advanced planning and security sweeps. My students, many of whom were already struggling with the challenges of adult education while working full-time jobs, would now have to undergo background checks simply to attend my classes. What about my teaching? I asked, the question that had been weighing on me since the previous evening's revelations. My literacy program at the community college, my volunteer work at the food bank, the book club I run at the library. These aren't just activities for me, they're commitments I've made to people who depend on them. Agent Morrison's expression softened slightly, revealing the human being behind the professional facade. We'll work with you to maintain as much continuity as possible. The president-elect has already indicated that he wants you to continue your education work in whatever capacity is feasible. We'll just need to adapt the security arrangements to accommodate your teaching schedule. David leaned forward, his expression serious but determined. Sarah, one of the reasons I fell in love with you is your commitment to serving others, especially those who don't have many advocates. I don't want the presidency to change that about you. If anything, I want your work to become a model for how the First Lady role can evolve to address real community needs. The idea that my small-scale literacy work could somehow become a national initiative was both thrilling and overwhelming. I thought about Maria Gonzalez, who is still working toward her GED while raising 3 children and holding down 2 part-time jobs. I thought about Robert Taylor, the veteran who had discovered at age 45 that his struggles in school had been due to undiagnosed dyslexia and was finally learning to read with confidence. These were the people whose stories needed to be told, whose challenges needed to be understood by policymakers who had never experienced the barriers that stood between them and educational achievement. There's something else we need to discuss, David said, his tone becoming more formal as he shifted into what I was beginning to recognize as his presidential mode. The transition team wants to accelerate our timeline. Given the viral nature of yesterday's announcement and the public's positive response, They're recommending that we move forward with a more formal introduction to the American people. What does that involve? I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve more cameras, more speeches, and more surrender of the privacy that had ended forever the moment Agent Morrison approached our wedding table. A joint interview with one of the major networks, probably within the next week. A town hall meeting in Riverside where we can showcase the community that shaped our values. And ultimately, a national tour where we visit communities similar to ours and listen to people's concerns about the challenges they're facing. The prospect of a national tour was both exciting and daunting. On one hand, it would give us the opportunity to highlight the needs and strengths of small-town America, to bring attention to the communities that too often felt forgotten by Washington politics. On the other hand, it would mean months of constant travel, public appearances, and the kind of intense scrutiny that could destroy any sense of normal life. Before we commit to any of that, I said, I want to go home. I want to go back to Riverside and have breakfast at the diner where I've been eating since high school. I want to check on Mrs. Hayes and make sure she's handling all the attention okay. I want to see my parents and help them process everything that's happened. I want to visit my grandmother's grave and tell her about yesterday. David's smile was understanding and supportive. Of course, we can't move forward authentically if we lose touch with the foundation that brought us here. Agent Morrison, can we arrange for a return to Riverside this afternoon? The logistics of a presidential motorcade returning to a small Ohio town proved to be more complicated than I had anticipated. Roads needed to be cleared, buildings needed to be secured, and local law enforcement needed to be coordinated with federal agents. The simple act of going home had become a major operation, involving dozens of people and multiple agencies. But when our convoy finally pulled up in front of Mitchell's hardware store on Main Street, the sight that greeted us made all the complexity worthwhile. The entire block was lined with people holding handmade signs reading, "Congratulations, Sarah and David. Riverside is proud," and "From our town to the White House." The Riverside High School marching band was playing patriotic songs with an enthusiasm that more than made up for their occasional wrong notes. My father stood in front of his store wearing a suit I had never seen him put on, except for weddings and funerals, his face glowing with a pride that seemed to have erased years of worry lines overnight. When I stepped out of the vehicle, he embraced me with an intensity that spoke to all the emotions he hadn't been able to express during the difficult months leading up to the wedding. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he whispered in my ear, his voice thick with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "I'm sorry for doubting you, for doubting him, for letting my fear make me cruel when I should have been supportive." "Dad," I said, holding him tightly, "yesterday changed everything for all of us. What matters is that we're here now, together, ready to face whatever comes next as a family." The crowd that had gathered was a mixture of longtime residents and curious visitors who had driven from neighboring towns to witness this unprecedented moment in Riverside's history. I recognized faces from my childhood, teachers who had shaped my education, neighbors who had watched me grow up, business owners who had provided my first jobs. These were the people who had formed the foundation of my character, and seeing their joy and pride in this moment was more meaningful than any political endorsement could have been. Mrs. Hayes pushed through the crowd with the determination of someone who had earned the right to special treatment through decades of community service. She was carrying a wrapped package that she pressed into my hands with a ceremonial solemnity that suggested its contents were significant. "This was your grandmother's," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the crowd noise. "She made me promise to give it to you when you achieved something special. I think becoming First Lady qualifies." Inside the package was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age, but its binding still strong. The first page bore an inscription in my grandmother's careful handwriting. "For Sarah, who will change the world with kindness. May these pages hold your dreams until they become reality." The gift was so perfectly timed, so precisely what I needed in this moment of transition, that I couldn't help but wonder if my grandmother had somehow foreseen this day. The journal would become my constant companion in the months ahead, a place to record the challenges and triumphs of our extraordinary journey, a connection to the woman whose wisdom had helped guide David's understanding of what small-town America truly needed. The impromptu celebration that followed had the organic quality of genuine community joy. Someone had brought a cake from the bakery down the street. The Methodist church ladies appeared with thermoses of coffee and hot chocolate. The high school principal announced that classes were canceled for the day so that students could participate in this historic moment. What had begun as a simple homecoming had evolved into a festival celebrating not just our success, but the community that had made it possible. David moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a natural politician, but more importantly, with the genuine interest of someone who truly cared about the people he was meeting. He remembered names from our previous visits, asked follow-up questions about family members and business concerns, and listened with the kind of focused attention that made each person feel valued and heard. It was during this informal meet-and-greet that Tom Brennan approached us with a proposal that would ultimately reshape our approach to the presidency. "David," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about understanding communities from the ground up. What if you continued that work as president? What if instead of just visiting places for campaign events or official ceremonies, you actually spent time living and working in different communities across the country?" The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than viewing the presidency as a position isolated in Washington, what if David used the office to truly understand the diverse experiences of American communities? What if the first family occasionally decamped from the White House to spend extended time in places like Riverside, learning firsthand about the challenges and opportunities facing ordinary Americans? "It would require significant security arrangements," Agent Morrison said when we ran the idea past him, "but it's not impossible. In fact, it might actually enhance security by making your location less predictable while simultaneously demonstrating your commitment to understanding all of America, not just the Washington bubble." The concept energized both David and me in a way that traditional political activities had not. This wasn't about photo opportunities or carefully staged events designed to generate positive media coverage. This was about genuine engagement, authentic relationship building, and the kind of deep understanding that could only come from shared experience. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd gradually dispersed, I found myself standing in front of the community college where I had taught literacy classes for the past 3 years. The building looked smaller somehow, more modest than I had remembered, but also more precious. This place had been where I had discovered my passion for education, where I had learned that teaching wasn't just about transferring information, but about empowering people to transform their own lives. Maria Gonzalez appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw me. She was one of my most dedicated students, a single mother who worked double shifts at the local diner while pursuing her GED with a determination that inspired everyone around her. She approached cautiously, clearly overwhelmed by the security presence and media attention. "Mrs. Chen," she said, using my new name with careful precision, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for our program. When they were going to cut the funding, you fought for us. When I wanted to give up because the math was too hard, you stayed after class to help me understand. You made me believe I could do things I never thought were possible." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most important of the entire day. Maria told me about her dreams of becoming a nurse, about the barriers she faced as a non-traditional student, about the difference the literacy program had made not just in her own life but in her ability to help her children with their homework. She spoke with the eloquence of someone whose education was hard-won, and therefore deeply valued. "I want you to know," I told her, "that the work we've done here, the relationships we've built, the progress you've made, that's not ending just because my circumstances have changed. If anything, it's expanding. Your story, your challenges, your success, these are the things that need to be understood at the highest levels of government." The promise I made to Maria that day became the cornerstone of what would eventually evolve into a revolutionary approach to the First Lady role. Rather than focusing primarily on ceremonial duties and safe, non-controversial causes, I would use the platform to elevate the voices and experiences of people like her, to bring the realities of community-level challenges into national policy discussions. As evening approached and we prepared to leave Riverside for the secure facility where we would spend the next few days in intensive briefings and planning sessions, I took one last walk through the neighborhood where I had grown up. The houses looked the same as they always had, modest but well-maintained, with front porches that invited conversation and yards where children played games that had been passed down through generations. But something fundamental had changed. The media attention generated by our story had brought national focus to this small Ohio town, and with that attention came opportunities that hadn't existed before. Tourism inquiries were already pouring in from people who wanted to visit the place that had shaped the president-elect and first lady. Economic development organizations were reaching out about potential investments in the community. The story of our wedding had become a symbol of small-town American values, and Riverside was poised to benefit from that symbolism in tangible ways. The responsibility of that was both thrilling and sobering. Our personal story had become part of the national narrative, and the way we handled that narrative would have real consequences for the people we cared about most. The spotlight that now followed us everywhere could be used to highlight the needs and strengths of communities like Riverside, but it could also overwhelm and exploit them if we weren't careful. Standing in front of the house where I had grown up, looking at the bedroom window where I had dreamed about my future as a teenager, I felt the full weight of the transformation that had occurred in just 24 hours. The girl who had once worried about whether she would get into college, whether she would find meaningful work, whether she would ever make a real difference in the world, was now married to the most powerful person on earth and positioned to influence policy decisions that would affect millions of lives. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges I couldn't yet imagine, scrutiny that would test every aspect of our relationship, and responsibilities that would require more strength and wisdom than I sometimes felt I possessed. But it would also be filled with opportunities to serve, to advocate, to make the kind of positive change that I had only dreamed about when I first started teaching literacy classes to adults who had been failed by the educational system. David found me there as the sun was setting, painting the familiar streets of my childhood in golden light that made everything look like a painting. "Are you ready?" he asked, the question encompassing not just our immediate departure, but the entire journey that lay ahead. I looked one more time at the house where my parents still lived, at the school where I had first learned to read, at the community that had shaped my understanding of what it meant to care for others. These would always be my roots, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. "I'm ready," I said, meaning it completely, "but I want to come back regularly. I want to remember where we came from, what we learned here, who we're serving. I don't want to lose touch with the people and values that brought us to this point." As our motorcade pulled away from Riverside that evening, heading toward a future none of us could have fully anticipated, I carried with me not just the memories of our extraordinary wedding day, but the understanding that the real work was just beginning. The transformation from small-town teacher to first lady would require everything I had learned about service, about building relationships, about finding strength in community and purpose, and helping others achieve their dreams. The empty chair at our wedding table had been filled, the family reconciled, the community celebrated. Now came the harder task of living up to the trust that had been placed in us, of using the platform we had been given to make life better for people like Maria and Mrs. Hayes and Robert Taylor and all the other Americans whose stories deserved to be heard at the highest levels of power. The road ahead was uncertain, but we would travel it together, guided by the values we had learned in places like Riverside, and committed to ensuring that the America we served would be one where every community mattered, every voice was heard, and every person had the opportunity to achieve their dreams, regardless of where they started or what obstacles they faced. 3 months into David's presidency, I stood in the East Wing of the White House, reviewing plans for what would become the most ambitious First Lady initiative in modern history. The community immersion program had grown from Tom Brennan's simple suggestion into a comprehensive approach to governance that was revolutionizing how the presidency connected with ordinary Americans. Instead of limiting our understanding of the country to briefing papers and polling data, we were spending 1 week each month living and working in different communities across America. The program had exceeded every expectation. Our first immersion had been in a farming community in Iowa, where David worked alongside corn farmers while I taught literacy classes at the local community center. The second had taken us to a former mining town in West Virginia, where we learned about economic transition and the challenges facing workers whose industries had disappeared. Each experience had provided insights that no amount of traditional political research could have delivered. My father had become one of the program's most enthusiastic supporters, traveling with us whenever his hardware store could spare him. The man who had once questioned David's worthiness had become his most trusted advisor on small business issues, providing the kind of practical perspective that Washington insiders often lacked. Bob Mitchell's transformation from skeptical father-in-law to presidential confidant had become a symbol of the administration's commitment to listening to voices that were typically excluded from policy discussions. The literacy initiative that had started in Riverside had grown into a national movement. Maria Gonzalez, who had finally earned her GED and started nursing school, now served as a spokesperson for adult education programs across the country. Her story of perseverance and achievement had inspired congressional funding for expanded literacy services, proving that individual narratives could drive systemic change when amplified by the right platform. Mrs. Hayes had become something of a celebrity in her own right, regularly appearing on morning television shows to discuss the importance of community elders in preserving local wisdom and values. At 72, she had found a new purpose as an advocate for intergenerational programs that connected young people with older community members. The nursing home where my grandmother had lived had been transformed into a model facility for innovative elder care, funded by federal grants that David had championed. The wedding that had started with my father's cruel declaration had become a touchstone for discussions about family, forgiveness, and the power of love to overcome prejudice. The video of our reception, watched by millions around the world, was studied in sociology classes as an example of how personal transformation could occur in real time when people were forced to confront their own biases and assumptions. But perhaps the most significant change had been in how we approached the presidency itself. Rather than governing from the isolation of Washington, David had created a model of leadership that was grounded in continuous community engagement. Policy decisions were informed by direct experience with the people who would be affected by them. Legislative priorities emerged from conversations with ordinary Americans, rather than lobbying by special interests. The empty chair that had once symbolized my father's rejection had become a metaphor for the seats at every policy table that needed to be filled by voices that had traditionally been excluded. We made it a practice to ensure that every major decision included input from people like the farmers in Iowa, the former miners in West Virginia, and the adult learners in community colleges across the country. As I prepared for another community immersion, this time in a Native American reservation in Montana, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that September day when Agent Morrison had first approached our wedding table. The girl from Maple Street had indeed become one of the most prominent women in America, but more importantly, she had found a way to use that prominence to amplify the voices and concerns of people whose stories deserve to be heard. The presidency had taught us that true leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions and listening carefully to the responses. It wasn't about projecting strength from a distance, but about building relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. Most importantly, it wasn't about ruling over people, but about serving alongside them in the ongoing work of building a more perfect union. Our marriage had not only survived the extraordinary pressures of the presidency, but had been strengthened by them. The challenges we faced together, the communities we served side by side, and the shared commitment to using our platform for the benefit of others had deepened our bond in ways that ordinary life never could have achieved. We had learned that love wasn't just about finding the right person, but about building a partnership that could withstand any storm and contribute to something larger than itself. The torn wedding veil, carefully preserved and displayed in our private quarters, had become a symbol of resilience and transformation. The silver thread that Mrs. Coulter had used to repair the tear caught the light from the Truman balcony windows each morning, reminding us that the most beautiful things often came from the process of healing what had been broken. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.